So what is humble ability? How many of you learned a new word in that video? There you go. Or as we're more accustomed to hearing the term humility, what is humility? You know, I think it's easier for us to understand humility by first looking at, okay, what is pride? And if we think about it, we have a lot of examples in our culture of this is what pride is. If you think about it, even let's think about social media. What's the biggest video streaming platform out there? What's it called? Facebook, but the biggest video streaming is YouTube. YouTube, it's about who? You. Or let's think about it. There's a photo sharing social media site called Instagram, and people post pictures that they've taken of themselves called what? Because who's important and who are you taking the picture of? But it's not only that we take pictures of ourselves and post them on Instagram. No. We've got to get the right filter. And for some, we've got to go the extra level of we're going to Photoshop that image so that everybody thinks we look a certain way. And so I want to show you how Instagram doesn't always map up to reality, okay? So this is oftentimes what life looks like on Instagram. You look at people, oh my goodness, they've got it together. This is reality. This is somebody in their front yard and a bunch of bushes. Or maybe it's this one. You know, that you look at this on Instagram, man, they've got it together. This just looks perfect. This is flawless. And then you realize they're in Lowe's. Like, how many of you have ever been in Lowe's and been like, you know, this would be a good photo spot right here with the blinds. Like, this really, I think this is the vibe I'm going for. Or maybe Instagram, it looks like this, but in real life, that's more what it's like. Or this, but in real life, looks a little bit more like that. You say, Zach, why are you showing us these pictures? Because really, if you think about it, why do we want to perfect the image of ourselves that we put out to people? It's because really deep in our heart, we think the world's about us. And we're prideful, and we want to put the best image possible of ourselves because we realize, like, these people, they will Photoshop these images, and they realize that's not actually them, but that's what they want to portray to the world around them. There's something in our culture, it's called a humble brag. It's when you brag about something, but you're trying to feign humility. How many of you have ever heard the term humble brag? How many of you have learned a new term today? Yay! There'll be a test next week. I'm just kidding. But I'll show you a few examples. There's this one that says, can we start a media campaign to question how I got into Columbia too? Still scratching my head about how I got accepted and demand answers. What is being said here? Hey, everybody, guess where I went to college? I went to Columbia, but I don't know how they would accept someone as ignorant as me. That's essentially what's being said. Or here's another one. Will Twitter be available for me in Paris, Milan, or the Maldives? I hope so, because it won't in Hong Kong or Singapore. Woe is this individual. They're going to have to deal without Twitter while they're in Hong Kong and Singapore. What are they saying? They're essentially bragging to the world, hey, I guess I'm going to travel a little bit, but let me let you know in a humble way. Will I have Twitter while I'm abroad? Let's look at another one. Bizarre experience 2,374, opening the in-flight magazine and finding your own face staring back. Finnair Blue Wing September issue. What is this person really saying? I'm a model, and I'm in a magazine. Everybody go look at the magazine. Look at how good I look. That's what they're saying, but what they phrase it as is, man, it was really awkward. I was on an airplane and I opened a magazine and I was in it. Like that. So they're trying to feign humility, but is it really working? No. But if we look at our culture, there's a lot of athletes and celebrities that, let's be honest, they don't even humble brag. They just straight brag. I'll give you a few examples because you want them. Let's be honest. You're like, well, I want examples. I need to know what's. So I will give them to you. You can say, thank you, Zachary. That was the worst audience participation ever. We're just going to end the sermon now. We're done. I'm kidding. But Muhammad Ali, he said, I'm not the greatest. Oh, doesn't that sound humble? I'm not the greatest. Let's keep reading. I'm the double greatest. Okay. Not only do I knock them out, I pick the round. Man, the humility of Muhammad Ali Another humble celebrity, we've got Mariah Carey. In this world, I call the shots, and I think I know best. Well, maybe, but I've seen a few performances where I wish Mariah knew how to stay on pitch. I'm just saying it, just putting it out there. Or I'm a NASCAR guy, so I had to throw one NASCAR reference in here because that's just how it rolls. A few weeks ago, Kyle Busch was asked, who is the greatest driver in NASCAR right now? His response, you're looking at him. Like, you chump. Anyway, or Gwyneth Paltrow, I'm really stinking good at my job, and people who are interesting and good know that. So let me interpret this for you. If you do not think Gwyneth Paltrow is a good actress, you are neither interesting or good in her own eyes. That is what she is saying. There you go. Or another one, Cristiano Ronaldo, soccer player. God sent me to earth to show people how to play football. Wow. We see these examples, and it's easier for us to sit here and be like, well, compared to those people, I've got no pride in my heart. We're good. Like, I'm not that. But I really want us to think, what about the pride in our own heart? Because it's almost in our culture. You see some of these quotes, and if you read the articles and the context in which these people said these things, a lot of times they're applauded. Oh, yeah, you think you're the best NASCAR driver? Yeah. Or you think you're the best actress? Yeah, that's good. Our culture almost celebrates pride. Have you noticed that? And so we hear some of these statements, and for some of us, we laugh it off. We're like, that's funny, but how sad is that? That our hearts would be that prideful. And so I want us to turn and look inward of where is the pride in my heart? Because if each and every one of us are honest, there's a lot of it in our own heart. We all have a lot of pride. So I want us to understand what is pride. If we look at a basic definition of pride, this is really basic, it would be an inflated understanding of self. And an inflated view of who we are. That's what pride is. But I want us to ask the question, what does Jesus say about pride? We see Proverbs 16 and 17. The Lord hates 6 things. In fact, 7 are detestable to him. You want to know what the list starts out with? Arrogant eyes. Arrogant eyes. Eyes that see the world as revolving around them. The number one thing in that list. Let's look at Proverbs 8:13. To fear the Lord is to hate evil. I hate arrogant pride, evil conduct, and perverse speech. What leads that list? I hate arrogant pride. Or Proverbs 16:5, everyone with a proud heart is detestable to the Lord. Be assured he will not go unpunished. When we read these verses, we're like, man, that's a little harsh. We got to ask ourselves the question, why does God hate pride so much? Because if we really want to expand our definition of pride and really fully understand what pride is when sinful human beings aspire to the status and position of God and refuse to acknowledge their dependence upon him. I'll read it again because I think we need to let that sink in. Pride is when sinful human beings aspire to the status and position of God and refuse to acknowledge their dependence upon him. There's an author by the name of John Stott, and he says it this way. He says, pride is more than the first of the 7 deadly sins. It is itself the essence of all sin. If you think about it, it's true. I mean, even think back to the Garden of Eden. We said pride is the essence of all sin. Adam and Eve, they're tempted with the fruit, and the serpent says, hey, if you eat this fruit, it will make you like what? God. And so what do Adam and Eve do? They eat of it. Because why? Because they believed in their heart that they rightfully deserve to be God, which is what pride is. It's us putting ourselves in the position of God and saying, really, God, it's not about you. Really, this whole world that exists, it revolves around me. And we think of other sins. Let's think theft. What is theft? It's saying, I deserve that object more than you do, so I'm taking it. That's what it is. At the base of it, it's pride. Or gossip. What is gossip? Gossip is saying, hey, I'm better than that person, and let me tell you why. That's what gossip is. Or lust, let's think in a sexual sense, lust is objectifying somebody and saying, I deserve that. And if we could go sin after sin after sin, and we find that really the core of it is pride that's in our heart. Why is this? Pride lifts us, Charles Bridges says it this way, he says, pride lifts up one's heart against God and contends for supremacy with him. Pride is us arguing with God about who deserves worship. That's really what it is. Jonathan Edwards, the great preacher, he says it this way. He says, pride is the greatest disturber of the soul's peace and sweet communion with Christ. Pride is the greatest disturber of the soul's peace and sweet communion with Christ. Honestly, if you've had a time in your relationship with God where it's rocky and it's rough, you may want to look at your heart and say, okay, God, is there pride in my heart? Because pride in our heart will disrupt our walk and our relationship with God. And I want to give you a side note. As I was reading and preparing for this sermon, one of the books that I was reading, it's by a guy named C.J. Mahaney, and it's just called Humility. I highly recommend it. It's a short book, and it's packed with a lot of biblical truth. But in this book, C.J. Mahaney said this. He said, you know what? Pride destroys unity. Pride destroys unity. And he went on to say, he said, every church that I've seen where there's been a split, you want to know what it was because of? Really, it was because of pride. And so he said, we need to, as churches, we need to fight against this because pride will lead us to focus on not the things of God, but to focus on ourselves. And I want to warn us as a congregation as we're going through this discovery process of where are we headed? Where are we going? It's easy for us to sit and say, well, why are they taking so long? I know where we need to go. We just need to do this, this, this. Well, that's pride in our own heart. Or it's on the other side, it's easy for us to sit here and say, well, that's not what we need to do. Well, what is that? It's pride in our own hearts. My desire for us as a church is that we would be known as a church full of humility. Because what humility is it's us seeing ourselves rightly in view of Christ. Because we see his perfection and his holiness, and then we see our sin and how depraved our heart really is. And so we accurately understand that this is the position in light of the gospel, in light of Christ. I have nothing other than him. That's what humility is. So I want us to dive in a little bit further to what humility is. But before I do that, there's an author by the name of Mike Renahan. And he says this in talking about pride in churches. He says, pride is more insidious in the church than radon in the home. I want my desire as your pastor, I want us to be a church that is united. And that means we must be a church that is humble because we understand our place in light of who Christ is. If we ask, what is humility? Humility really is an accurate understanding of self. It's us accurately understanding who we are. John Calvin, he put it this way. He said, it is evident that man never attained to a true self-knowledge until he has previously contemplated the face of God and come down after such contemplation to look into himself. Or to say it a little differently, C.J. Mahaney says it this way, humility is honestly assessing ourselves in light of God's holiness and our sinfulness. Humility is honestly assessing ourselves in light of God's holiness and our sinfulness. Because really, when we look at the holiness of God and how perfect and righteous and worthy of our praise he is, and then we look at ourselves, how sinful, how depraved, how wretched we are, we can't do anything but be humble because we realize how desperately we need Christ, how desperately we need the gospel. And I want to make sure we understand, because a lot of times when we talk about humility, there's confusion about what humility really means. Humility is not self-loathing or beating ourselves up or saying, I have no value. That is not humility. Because Christ says, I created you in my image. You have value, you have inherent value. We're created in his image. So that's not what humility is. So I want us to understand that humility is not thinking less of ourselves, because God has given us gifts and abilities to use to honor and glorify him. So God has given that to us. So it's not humble to say, oh, I have no gifts. I can't. That's not humility. Humility is not thinking less of ourselves. It's thinking of ourselves less. Thinking of others more than us. Thinking, even more than that, thinking of God more than we think of ourselves. And as we look at this, what's the source of biblical humility? If we really want to understand it, we talked about this last week when we were talking about repentance. 1 Corinthians 10:13, it says, no temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind, and God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. What's the source of humility? It's God. And it's us rightfully understanding our place in light of who he is. That's where humility comes from. Real quick, what I want to do, I want to look at pride and humility in the life of James and John. John read that passage earlier, and I want to look at those passages and look sort of at the lives of James and John and sort of trace this theme of pride and humility. Does that sound good? That sounds good. Give me some thumbs up. There we good. Say, yep. Just making sure you're with me. There we go. Mark 9:33, it says this, they came to Capernaum. When he was in the house, he asked them, what were you arguing about on the way? Which I find this funny, okay? Jesus is God. He knows what they were arguing about, right? Can we agree on that? And he was like, and not to mention he was walking right beside them, but he sort of feigns like, oh, I don't know. Hey guys, what were you arguing about? And I love what happens here. Speaking of James and John, but they were silent. Like, James and John are like, I ain't telling them. No. You want something? No, not me. No. Why are they doing this? It's like they're a toddler with their hand caught in the cookie jar. That's sort of the image that you get of what's going on here. Because what were they talking about? On the way, they had been arguing with one another about who was the what? Greatest. So they're arguing about who is the greatest, and they're like, I don't want to tell Jesus that that's what we were talking about, so we're just going to be quiet. So what does Jesus do? Verse 35, sitting down, he called the 12 and said to them, if anyone wants to be first, he must be last and servant of all. So James and John are arguing about what? Who's going to be what? The greatest. But what does Jesus say? If anyone wants to be first, he must be last and be servant of all. And so you would think that this awkward exchange, would you think this would sink in with James and John? Like, it's like, okay, Jesus just said, who's first is last. Do you think it sinks in? How many of you are like, yeah, that sinks in? No. How many of you are like, no, I've read the Bible. It doesn't. Let's be honest, would it sink in with us? No, because we continue to sin the same way. Let's read on Mark 10, just one chapter. Like, we're not even talking like a few chapters, just one chapter. Just one chapter over. What's going on is the disciples are traveling with Jesus to Jerusalem, and they believe that that's where Jesus will set up his military and political kingdom. So they're traveling with him. They're going to Jerusalem like, hey, Jesus is going to set up, his military and political kingdom, and we're going to be there with him. We're going to be great. It's going to be awesome. That's sort of the mindset and what's going through the disciples' mind. So what do James and John ask? Oh, boy. Verse 35 of Mark 10, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, approached him and said, everybody take a deep breath, because like this one, you're like, oh, but everyone just, here we go. Teacher, we want you to do whatever we ask. Oh boy. Like what in the world is going, it's like James and John are treating Jesus like a cosmic Santa Claus. Like, hey, Jesus, we want to sit in your lap and we're going to tell you what we want for Christmas and you're going to give it to us. Yay. Like that's what's going on in this passage and you read it. How many of you read that and it sort of makes you cringe? You're like, oh, did that just happen? Oh my goodness. Like, no, really, that's in the Bible. That is in there. And so how does Jesus respond? What do you want me to do for you? He asked them. Not necessarily how I would have thought he would have responded. They answered him, allow us to sit at your right and at your left in glory. So what do they say, essentially? They say, hey, Jesus, I know you got 12 of us disciples, but can we be the most important? Because we think we are, and we just want to make sure you agree that we're the most important. We don't need to let those other 10 know, but we're good, right? That's what's going on. They're like, hey, Jesus, we want to be the most important. Now, how do you think the other 10 disciples react to this? How many of you are like, they were like on board with it? Oh, they're like, yeah, James and John, I mean, we're not as good as they are. No, that's not what happens. This is what happens. Verse 41, when the 10 disciples heard this, they began to be indignant with James and John. And we got to ask the question, okay, why are they indignant with James and John? Because if we want to be honest, they believe themselves to be the most important. That's why. And so we look at this passage, and if we're honest with ourselves, how many of us can admit that we struggle with pride? Anybody? I mean, I do. I think we all do. Like we said, that's the root of all sin is pride. And we look at this passage and we look at James and John, and it might be easy for us to say, well, I'm not that prideful. I didn't ask Jesus to be numero uno. I didn't do that. But let's look at the other disciples because they were just as prideful. Because why were the disciples angry at James and John? Because they believed that they were the most important. And so in this, maybe we don't track with James and John, but we at least need to see ourselves in the other disciples who were indignant because of what James and John had asked. There's an author by the name of C.J. Mahaney I mentioned earlier. He says, it's easy for us at times to disdain the disciples and fail to recognize our face in their portrait. They argued on the road about who was the greatest. We may not openly argue about this, but don't we engage in the same debate every day in our private thoughts? We look at this passage, and how does Jesus respond? He gathers the disciples again, and this is what he said. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to what? To serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. It's interesting you see this passage, and the one in this story who is the center of the universe, who is God in human flesh, says, no, I came to serve and to give my life so that you could have a relationship with God. As we go further, we look in Acts 12, verses 1 and 2. And it says this is speaking of James. About that time, King Herod violently attacked some who belonged to the church, and he executed James, John's brother, with the sword. We see James go from someone who, hey, Jesus, it's about me. I need to be the number one guy, to what happens in this passage. James gives his life for the gospel. So something has changed in his heart. He goes from, I want to be number one, to I give my life for the sake of the gospel. Well, let's look at John. 1 John 3:16, it says this, this is how we have come to know love. He laid down his life for us. We should also lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. And John wrote that. The same John that we were just talking about, who said, hey, it's about me, I want to be number one, writes, we should also lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. Something changed. But between those passages in Mark, and between these passages, what changed? Jesus' death and resurrection. That's what changed. You see, the cross changes our perspective. Because when we look at the cross, we look at Christ, we realize that life never has been and never will be about us. It's always been about him. Always. And we see that James and John, Jesus dies, he's buried, he resurrects, and they realize that, no, it's not about me. Jesus, it's about you. And we see one of them give their life for the gospel. The other says we should also lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. It makes me think of, there's a hymn that we're going to sing in a minute, and it says this. It says, when I survey the wondrous cross on which the Prince of Glory died, So when I look at the cross, what is my reaction? My richest gains I count but loss, and I pour contempt on all my pride. When I look at the cross, I am contemptful of my pride because I realize how I pale in comparison to Christ. That's what it's saying. The hymn goes on, the second verse says, "Forbid me, Lord, that I should boast, save in the death of Christ my God. All the vain things that charm me most, I sacrifice them all to his blood." It's interesting, you see that this verse, and essentially what the author is saying, Isaac Watts, he's saying, I have nothing to boast in. There's nothing I have to be proud of. The only thing I have to be proud of is the death and resurrection of Christ, my God. It's sort of like this. I'm gonna use an illustration. Is that okay with y'all? If it's not, just close your eyes. I don't know. So these glasses right here, if I put them on, I've used these before in an illustration, but if I put these on, thank you for the laughter. I appreciate that. Yes, I look like a bozo. It's okay. But if I put these on, what does everything look like? The lens is blue, so I see blue. Everything looks blue. And it's like this with the gospel. You see, the cross colors the way we view things. Just like these glasses color the way I see all of y'all. Y'all look like you're all a member of the Blue Man Group when I look through those. That's what it looks like. How many of you actually know who that is? There we go. Yeah, that's exciting. But similarly, when we look at the world through the perspective of the cross, it colors the way we see things. And so we don't see the world as revolving around us. We see it as revolving around Christ. And so I want to ask you, has the cross of Christ changed your perspective on who you are? Has it colored the way that you look at the world to the point that you don't see the world as revolving around you, you see it as revolving around Christ? The devotional that we've been doing together as a church, it says this: do you want to be set free from self-concern to love and serve others in humility? Do you want to be set free from numbering your accomplishments, talents, or network? Look to Christ, who was humble in life and broken in death, to set you free from your self-concern and pride. If we want to be set free from our pride, we need to truly understand the God that we serve and the sacrifice that he made on the cross. I'm going to invite the band up, and we're going to sing and have a time of response. And as I mentioned, we're going to sing the song "When I Survey the Wondrous Cross" that we just looked at. And so as we sing this song, the first verse, "When I survey the wondrous cross on which the Prince of Glory died, my richest gain I count but loss, and pour contempt on all my pride." I want to ask you this question. Will you allow your reflection upon the cross of Christ to lead you to honestly assess yourself in light of God's holiness and your sinfulness? The second verse, it says, "Forbid me, Lord, that I should boast, save in the death of Christ my God." Will you forever seek to boast not in yourself, but in the gospel of Jesus Christ? Because when we truly understand who God is, we realize that we have nothing at all to boast about other than Christ and the sacrifice that he made on the cross. So in a second, we're going to sing this song, and I encourage you as we sing this song, if you want to come to this altar and pray, if you want to kneel where you're at and pray, if you want to stand and sing, but I want you to reflect and look at your heart and say, God, okay, where is there pride in my life? Reveal it to me, and as I sing this song, God, I give that to you. God, I want to see myself in light of the cross and realize that the world isn't about me, it's about you. And so, God, where in my life have I made it about me? And forgive me, I repent. And as we sing this song, just lift that to him and say, God, I give this to you. I give you the worship, I give you the praise because you deserve it anyway. Forgive me for turning the worship and the praise in on myself and making it about me. So in a second, we're going to sing. And if you want, John will be up here. I'll be up here. If you want to come pray with one of us, we'll be up here. If you want to kneel at the altar and pray and do business with God, come kneel at this altar.